Today's guide is something of a mix of story and actual economic guide. Rather than being a broad guide about how to make an economy that caters to every need of the market, we'll be focusing on how to build up a strongly consumer-oriented food economy, looking at supply chains, company synergies, and the ups and downs of such a strategy. Alongside that, we'll also be painting a beautiful story about culinary imperialism with the side effect of ending world hunger or something. Italy is a region of Victoria 3 that I haven't actually played very much, not for any particular reason, I just haven't really gotten around to playing them. I did a video as the Pope ages ago where we went through a story about a French kid becoming the King of Rome and spreading Catholicism, but who cares about all that character-oriented storytelling? If there's anything true about Victoria 3, it's that the economy is the heart and soul of the game, and I have often considered how to tie the economy into the story meaningfully. I hadn't thought of the idea before, but the Victoria 3 developers actually gave me an answer which I didn't even know would work so well. As of the latest patch, we can now rename prestige goods. Truly an immense contribution to the quality and joy of Victoria 3 this change. Now that we can rename prestige goods, the ability to tell stories using the movement of goods and establishment of companies actually expands significantly. And with that, I wanted to make a video about Italy, and one which connects to my life a little bit. Before that personal connection, let's talk about Sardinia Piedmont and what makes them special. First of all, they are historically the nation that would go on to unite Italy in real life, so they're a natural choice for an Italian playthrough. Secondly, their state of Piedmont grows rice. And rice is quite valuable both for my economic plan and as a good. Rice farms make a lot of grain, but require a lot of workers and don't have as many labor-saving production methods as wheat and other grains. Nonetheless, its ability to pump out a lot of grain with a lot of jobs makes depeasanting easy and provides a lot of goods to help the standard of living in the nation. You know, in Victoria 3, we too often pursue an economy at the expense of our people, but today I intend to put Italy on the path to really improving the world through the power of the culinary arts. Since we can rename prestige goods, the boring who cares good of fine grain can be transformed into something greater, as can the boring old prestige groceries and eventually even, perhaps, prestige fertilizer. That's right, today's Italy video is going to be about making the ultimate food supply chain and seeing how far we can take it. Strap in and prepare to learn the power of groceries, pal. In a place where revolution is in the air, there's an interest in not upsetting the vast masses of peasants that could easily overthrow the government if they only knew they had the power to do so. For that reason, Carlo Alberto di Savoia, the king of Sardinia Piedmont, has taken an interest in the well-being of Piedmont's people. He's a bit of a romantic after all and still believes in an autocratic monarch that doesn't abuse his power. In the interest of bringing to his people prosperity, he granted a charter to the rice farmers of Piedmont which allowed them to found Juan San Pedro's Premium Pasta, named after, in real life, one of our beloved channel members. And, in-game, we'll say that one of the company founders named it after his pen pal from Rio de Janeiro or something. The company would be granted monopoly rights to the sole production of rice in all Italy, and trade rights. Unfortunately for King Carlo Alberto, the executive of this, perhaps soon-to-be highly influential company is a republican of the petite bourgeoisie, but given that the kingdom is still an absolute monarchy, it won't really matter what executive Amadeo Bolmida thinks. From here, in terms of what we'll be building, I have to admit that you just can't run a Victoria 3 economy on only rice, so I am building some iron, coal, and tools, which are a staple of any successful economy in this game, but rest assured, I am dedicated to the rice game. As once I get enough mines and tools up to make for a reasonable government balance, I queued up over 50 rice farms, and we're just going for it, man. The nice thing about consumer goods like grain is that as they lose profitability due to being too cheap to sell at a good margin, the pops that consume them will gain standard of living, which makes them buy more. That, in theory, means infinite demand with time, but grain can only be consumed for a basic food need, not for all the luxury food needs of a pop at a higher standard of living, so grain itself is limited for consumption, but once we get groceries, things change. Groceries can be consumed up to 99 standard of living for all food needs, and grocery industries consume grain. Thus, we do eventually have an infinite demand loop, more or less. In the meantime, turns out it's kind of hard to get good prosperity on a rice-oriented company because rice farms are terrible for productivity. I mentioned before that rice uses a lot of workers, and that means that for each pound of profit being generated, we're using more workers than, say, a wheat farm might use. That keeps productivity quite low, unfortunately. The thing is, that's fine for now, because ultimately, I'm not going to be able to possibly get the fine grain prestige good given how much the top 3 grain producers actually produce. Quick Victoria 3 lesson, what is productivity? Well, this is a term used in real life too, and it refers to the output per worker, or just per input in general, of a business. In Victoria 3's case, output is just profits, and we only consider workers, not inputs, when it comes to productivity. Companies gain prosperity when productivity is high, regardless of profits, which is weird to me, given companies' goals are to make money, not to be efficient, but whatever. Despite my focus on grains and farming, I do still need to industrialize a bit, so the iron and coal of Piedmont will be exploited, if only to serve the future purpose of what has become lovingly named the people's economy. This might sound very socialist in nature, and that's sort of King Carlo's intent. He wants to be the people's king because he knows that in the near future, there will be a reckoning of nationalism across Europe and especially across Italy, whose dreams of unification are inevitable. After getting some of those critical industrial goods built, we can see that the farms hit the top of the queue, and we've got a lot of them planned. I'm more or less intending to just fill out the arable land here with rice, and here's an interesting thing to be said for Victoria 3's economics. You might think that by producing so much grain, we'll be gaining a lot of standard of living, since the price of a commonly consumed good will reduce, and there's some accuracy to that, but remember that the price of a good is only as useful to a pop as they have income to buy it. Since rice farms use a lot of employment, we'll be giving out a lot of jobs here, but these jobs, quite frankly, are going to suck, and this is related to the productivity number we mentioned earlier. Well, rather, the productivity number is derived from the massive number of workers, I should say. Grain and fruit don't sell for much, and yet require a ton of workers. As such, there aren't many profits left over to pay workers a reasonable wage. As a general heuristic, if you want to evaluate a building's ability to generate standard of living for your nation, check its productivity. A rice farm will have okay-ish profits, but its productivity will be about as low as it can go, leading to low wages, and without wages, pops lose standard of living. Another general heuristic about standard of living, wages contribute significantly more to a pop's SOL than the cost of their goods, and that's because a good can only be at the very lowest possible price, 75% lower than its base price, and of course you'll never actually reach that low without using subsidies to destroy your budget. On the other hand, wages are infinitely scalable upwards. Anyway, as part of the people's economy and its attempts to improve Italian life, the profits from the rice farms were reinvested into some grocery industries. Groceries are much more productive and generally profitable than rice, but they also consume the goods which rice farms make, meaning we can translate our profitable but unproductive rice farms into profitable and productive grocery jobs. When we raise the price of grain by purchasing it for a grocery industry, you might worry that this will affect the standard of living, but there are two notes about that. First of all, as mentioned earlier, wages are far more important than consumption costs, but second of all, groceries are also food. Groceries are a replacement good for grain, even for basic food, so if groceries are cheaper than grain, pops will just buy groceries instead of grain, thus maintaining their standard of living even if grain becomes expensive. That being said, with how much rice we're making, the price of grain won't rise for a long time. At the last part of this economy's creation, the king got to work passing a law which would guarantee the right to associate to all the workers. In terms of what this law really does, it turns off some exploitative production methods for certain plantations, but reduces the overall radicalism of any socialist or communist movements. It's not really that big of an effect, given your socialists will still agitate for socialism one day, but this is more of a roleplay choice in this case. I want our Italian king to represent a sort of enlightened monarchism which pacifies its people with food and kind treatment. Shortly after finishing up that law's passage, the springtime of the peoples did begin, and this is exactly what King Carlo Alberto was waiting for. He can rest easy on his throne knowing that while Europe struggles to maintain the very sinew of its construction, he'll be enjoying some risotto made by farmers that only have love for their king in their hearts. Despite his best efforts, the king forgot about something, and that was that his kingdom is Sardinia Piedmont, not just Piedmont, and as such he made no jobs in Sardinia, leading to a generally more radical population over there. A radical insurrection began on the island threatening to secede from the kingdom, and of course that's not something he can allow to happen. In what some might call an act of great stubbornness, King Carlo Alberto simply doubled down on his people's economy plan and founded a second company. This is the Righteously Blessed Daily Pasta product, named after one of our channel members, of course. The intention with this pasta company is to make yet more food of an even higher quality available, while also making yet more jobs. Despite this push for more food seeming to be about addressing the Sardinian rebels, the investors of the nation really didn't see the state as a safe investment, so they kept building in Piedmont. The bigger reason for this, than any RP about safety, is that all the rice is in Piedmont, so a grocery industry there gets a better price on grain due to how market access price impact works. Goods have a local price and a market price, and businesses actually pay the price for a good based on the local price. When goods move from one state to another, they gain or lose price according to the market access price impact of the state they're going to. Outputs lose price, meaning profits go down, and inputs gain price, meaning costs go up. So market access price impact can be very important. It's not a huge deal in this case because we have lots of infrastructure, and as such, market access price impact isn't hugely different between Piedmont and Sardinia. But if you're a greedy capitalist looking to make as much money as possible, the extra 15% price on inputs and lost 15% profits on outputs makes Sardinia unattractive for sure. That being said, this revolution is unlikely to go anywhere because the radicals of Sardinia just don't quite have their hearts in it, unlike the British radicals, who have already taken everything south of Hadrian's Wall and don't look like they'll be stopping anytime soon. I really enjoy the springtime of the peoples, and how it can sometimes make Europe a bunch of nation-state republics, or it can do pretty much nothing, just depends on how good a job the AI has done in the first 10 years of the game or so. Check out the food industries in March of 1845, by the way. We can see that their profits aren't amazing or anything, but the price of grain is quite low, and that's helping a lot. Nonetheless, sugar remains expensive, and getting more sugar will be tough without looking overseas or trading. For now, we're using the fruit PM on our rice farms to make just a trickle of sugar, but it's not nearly enough to feed the grocery machine of Piedmont. We can see similar but also quite low profits over on the rice farms in May. Sugar is the highest price good they're producing, but it's also the one they produce in the lowest quantity. They're able to keep up profits despite the cratered price of grain and fruit thanks to the high throughput here, which on a building with no inputs means this is a pure output modifier, quite strong. Nonetheless, we still see that 3.6 pound productivity, which means wages are quite low. Now that we've established a pretty strong agricultural economy here, well, at least as strong of a one as you can make this early in the game, I wanted to refocus on industrial goods a little, and considering how upset Sardinia is, I decided that we would invest a bit there. Sardinia has many resources and almost 100,000 peasants. If we can get those people working in the mines and producing goods for the nation, they'll be making wages for themselves and contributing to the nation's economy. With these promises, and the success of the grocery and grain economy so far, the springtime of the peoples came to an end in May of 1845, and soon after, Juan San Pedro's rice company hit prosperity. It would be nice to get fine grain, but to do that we'll need to be in the top 3 producers, and that's just not gonna happen, as mentioned earlier. In terms of our ways to actually make it happen, we'd have to use better production methods to make more grain out of our limited arable land, but if we start using higher level production methods, our profits will just vanish, mostly because grain is already cheap, and we'll suddenly be needing to buy an expensive input good, fertilizer. By this point, we're going to start looking outwards and consider our role in the Risorgimento, but before then, we have one last piece of the people's economy to implement: healthcare. Working the farms is tiring, hard work, and the need for healthcare is one which will even further satisfy the once radical peoples of Sardinia Piedmont. To get access to healthcare faster, I'm also going to make some universities, and in so doing, King Carlo Alberto's Italy will become one known for its modern way of life and plentiful food. Nonetheless, none can call this land Italy until it's ruled by one king from the Po to the Toe, and if anyone will rule this peninsula, only the House di Savoia could do it right. The next couple of years would be focused on building up trade centers, ports, and more buildings in general with the intent of just making a strong economy. When it comes to playing well in Victoria 3, a lot of times you just want a higher GDP number regardless of what buildings it comes from, and a higher GDP comes from higher construction, which in turn is supported by a larger investment pool. The investment pool is directly connected to the profits on your buildings, so high profits are good. Trade facilitates high profits because it creates more demand for goods without increasing any costs on the building. Thus, we'll be looking to export some of our grain and groceries to create more profits, and perhaps to import stuff we make less of, like sugar. Here's a list of the trades we've got going as of August of 1851. We are importing sugar for the groceries, of course, and we're exporting fruit, which is the byproduct of our farms. If both fruit and grain are low in price, why are we only exporting fruit? That's because grain is used by the grocery industries, so its price isn't cratering quite as hard, although we are still exporting some grain, but you can tell by these yellow bars how much of the good in the total market is going to trade and how much is domestic. Fruit's bar is quite yellow, so a lot is going overseas, while grain is barely yellow, so it's mostly staying home. In terms of other preparations before the Risorgimento, I'm passing proportional taxation, which came through in November that year. With proportional taxation, we tax dividends on buildings, so profits on anything in the nation much more directly benefit the government treasury. Afterwards, we got to work on public healthcare, which I know was part of the previous chapter, but it took a while to research pharmaceuticals, so I actually got to implementing it around November of 1851. In the actual Risorgimento journal, there's this button where you can increase radicals in Austria's Italian states, and sometimes it results in a rebellion, sometimes it doesn't. I click it because, I don't know, why not I guess, right? It's by no means a surefire way to get Austria out of Italy. The only guaranteed way to do that is to fight them. Securing foreign support will make such a fight much easier, and I figured I'd hitch my chances of uniting Italy to Prussia. These days, Prussia tends to form Germany somewhat consistently, but not always, which is probably the best way to have RNG in the game. When King Carlo Alberto reached out to the Prussian king, the two had a shared ambition to unite their respective linguistic and cultural groups, and found common ground in pursuing that to the detriment of Austria. This took the form of a defensive pact, but one poorly timed, as Prussia was already being a little invaded by France. By August of 1856, Prussia was definitely looking like it'd be losing its war to unite Germany, but the Prussian AI is persistent in this patch, and I suspect that won't be the only attempt they make at unification. Looking for further support, Carlo Alberto used his connections to the Holy Alliance to speak to the Russian Tsar, who was always happy to support a fellow absolutist in Europe. The two signed a defensive pact as well, albeit with some economic concessions. If Austria can be ripped from Prussia and Russia, their two closest friends, then there won't be any issue uniting Italy. As our king makes more and more international fame for his revolutionary people's economy and connections to the great monarchs of Europe, the peasants of lesser Italian states have started to look up to him, and as a result, the Duchy of Tuscany was overthrown and its people voted to join the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, leading to this game's first territorial gain. For a people to simply get rid of their rulers and choose new ones felt quite unprecedented, and in so doing, did Carlo Alberto attract attention from the great powers, some positive, some negative, but all important nonetheless. Unfortunately for our ambitious king, the real obstacle to Italy's sovereignty would come from a bit further overseas than he perhaps expected. In August of 1857, news that the recently established British Republic had declared war to subjugate the Papal States shook the Italian world. They'd been so focused on Austrian oppression that they'd forgotten about the other great powers and their potential for involvement in the peninsula. Thankfully, the British have only declared they'd be subjugating the Pope, and that gives the king a way to stop this foreign intervention. Little tip for you minor power players out there: if your neighbors are being bullied by great powers and you want to conquer them first, attack the moment that the great powers war begins and conquer as many states as you can. In Victoria 3, nations can't join wars in the middle of them except through violating sovereignty, which is a bug that 99% of players aren't even aware of, but let's set that aside. Britain will defeat the Pope, that much is obvious, but when they win, the Pope will only be a protectorate. My war will be to directly conquer all the Papal States, and Britain can't intervene once the war starts. What sucks is that it's a very high infamy cost to conquer all the Papal States, and what's worse, Egypt decided to defend the Pope for some reason. I couldn't tell you why the Egyptians have an interest in Italy, but since they do, this war will be tough. As if that wasn't bad enough, the two Sicilies joined the war, and although they're not too strong, they're a pebble which, when combined with Egypt's boulder, push things just a bit further into being nearly impossible. Nonetheless, the Papal States cannot fall into British hands, because then we'll never be able to get them, so Carlo Alberto will mobilize all the Italians he can to fight this strange Neapolitan Egyptian coalition. In terms of gameplay, how we win this is that we have to never attack and simply defend this front in Tuscany until the Egyptians and Sicilians lose their war support from casualties. Once they leave the war, obviously we can take on the Pope in a 1v1. You might see a green number in the circle and think that I can perhaps defeat the coalition of forces here, but be careful about that, because lose one battle and you'll lose all your manpower and the enemy's overwhelming size will press the advantage. If I lose Tuscany, I'll never land there again as my navy is tiny, not to mention the war goal on me is humiliation, and holding Tuscany will tick that down for me, so yes, it'll take a while, but staying on the defensive for a few months to years is the correct move here. Even on defensive, the enemy did eventually attack, and they were winning the occasional battle, losing other battles, and essentially, I'm just praying that we get good combat rolls. We need good tactics, and we need good combat width, none of which we have any control over. Sicily left the war soon after taking heavy casualties in Tuscany, and Egypt held out a bit longer, finally capitulating in March of 1859. Now that they're gone, it's time to take Rome. There's an important symbolism to Rome's occupation, and especially now that a Union Jack sits over the Vatican, is the role of Carlo Alberto as a liberator ever more important. The people of Rome were quite happy to be emancipated from the tyranny of their papal overlord, and naturally King Carlo did not harm the Pope or depose him or make the church subservient to the kingdom or anything like that. He simply allowed the man to continue his duties in life, but he'd have to get it all done without harvesting revenues from the peoples of Romagna, Umbria, and Lazio. With the kingdom's expansion to central Italy complete, it has become clear who will be the destined uniter of the peninsula, and in even better news, Carlo Alberto's friends in Prussia made another attempt to unite Germany in April of 1865. After a long struggle against the stubborn French Republic, the Prussians have finally succeeded in uniting Germany, taking even Alsace-Lorraine in August of 1867. In the correspondence between the two kings, now one a Kaiser, Carlo congratulated his friend on his success, but told him to keep the men mobilized for yet more victories on the horizon. Pretty much immediately after Germany unified, Carlo Alberto began the play to unite Italy, taking on Sicily and Austria. The Holy Alliance has turned on Austria, with Carlo convincing the Kaiser and the Tsar to fight alongside him in dismantling the Austrian Empire. Italy will be completely unified, and the Germans will be paid with the conquest of Bohemia and the Russians an investment agreement with Hungary. The only nation to join Austria's side was, hilariously, the Dominion of India. Not Britain itself, just India alone, and again, much like with Egypt, I can't imagine why they'd have an interest here, but I do not fear India when I have the might of Germany and Russia on my side. I'd say there was a real struggle to win this war to make dramatic tension, but, well, with some of the most powerful great powers fighting against one of the usually weaker great powers, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for loss here. By February of 1869, all of Austria, barring Vienna, was occupied, and the Sardinian army marched south to Sicily by the following month. The Sicilian kingdom fell shortly after, then, with Vienna completely surrounded, the Habsburg Kaiser surrendered his dominion of Italy to the Italians in shame. Austria is not looking so good now, and Sardinia-Piedmont looks absolutely stunning. Now, you might be asking why I'm not forming Italy right away, and that's actually for a very particular reason which I'll explain much later. Now comes the manifestation of the House di Savoia's dreams of expanding the people's economy, the Union of Gastronomists, or in Italian, l'Unione dei Gastronomi, a cultural commonwealth of culinary mastery. Checking on our companies in June of 1869, I don't yet have access to any prestige goods, but at this point the idea behind the run is to get these prestige goods and start exporting them across the world to spread Italian cuisine and more importantly make a ton of money selling it, and so begins the true purpose of the Risorgimento. Italian identity is closely intertwined with its food, and now that Italy is one, pasta will rule the world. And so we've finally come around to my personal connection to this playthrough. If you pay attention during my live streams, which I do here and there, then you may have on occasion heard me talk about the pain of having to cook for someone with celiac disease. Between me and my partner, I'm the one that cooks, and well, she's got celiac disease, guys. That means that even a micron of anything made of wheat, barley, rye, or oats can ruin my partner's day at least, and perhaps even the month or more if it's enough of a gluten contamination. I'm grateful to live in Canada, where gluten-free products are plentiful and easy to access, but man, do I miss not having to check the ingredient list and everything. You know, I was making some kufta, one of my favorite Turkish dishes to cook, both for its taste, ease of cooking, and versatility, and I want to put some gochujang in it to give it some spice, you know. Of course, there's a little bit of wheat in it though, so now I can't use it. So annoying, and you'd be amazed by how many things use wheat, rye, or barley totally randomly. One time I was looking for cereal, and you know Rice Krispies, something you'd think would be made of, like, rice? Well, those are actually made with barley, so no Rice Krispies for me. Anyway, rant over. The point of this is to say that I'm going to be making gluten-free products using all of the rice in Piedmont, and thanks to the ability to rename prestige goods, I can actually do that. Since I've united Italy, I can finally produce enough grain to actually get to work on making fine grain, so we'll let that journal tick up until we begin producing our premium gluten-free rice-based pastas. Shortly after, I also hit prosperity on the grocery company, meaning our prestige groceries are on the way. Now, there's no way to filter out the fact that some of our grain will come from wheat farms in the market, instead of all of it coming from rice, but because the rice company can only control rice, rye, and millet, I can make sure I never conquer any rye, and thus be able to produce perfectly gluten-free grains for the groceries. That means that our righteously blessed daily pasta company will be able to make two product lines, a gluten-free set of pastas and a regular set of pastas, of course being careful to avoid cross-contamination. Such an important task, maintaining that lack of contamination, demands attention, and so King Carlo Alberto, who historically should have died like 20 years ago by the way, got to work on creating the Sardinia-Piedmont Council of Pasta, represented by the technocracy law in this case. Only a strong bureaucracy composed of the most detail-oriented and intelligent people in the kingdom can ensure that the pastas of Italy are up to par and safe of contamination. Despite the obvious supremacy of Italian cuisine, Carlo Alberto was quite happy to allow outside influences, but not all were willing to give up their culinary secrets. He arranged for the invasion of Chile and later Argentina, whose food he was interested in learning more about. Rather than outright conquering them, he'll be turning them into protectorates, which serves the dual purpose of adding more members to the Union of Gastronomists and reducing the infamy cost of the invasions. This run was recorded before infamy got bugged, and by the way, if you're playing Victoria 3 and the reduced infamy on taking subject bug is bothering you, just use the beta patch. Nonetheless, taking on subjects even without the infamy bug is much cheaper than outright conquering states. During the build-up to war, the kingdom's pasta council convened for its first meeting, and technocracy passed. The primary issue they were figuring out during the first council was how to grow more grains. Italy's arable land is limited, and the demand for Italian products will likely explode once the chefs of our nation cook up something truly legendary. Well, a new company was founded with the express purpose of figuring out how to grow more food. This is Moral V's Immoral Fertilizers, the name of the company being an ironic take on our channel member Moral V's name. Why are they immoral? Well, heavy use of the chemical fertilizers these guys are making might cause some damage to the environment, but ultimately, why would it matter when the pasta ends justify the pasta means? By the way, since I haven't shown it off at all in this run, here's the current politics of the kingdom as of March of 1871. The church has a lot of power, and that's mostly because I've been granting them political concessions to get things done. Also, we have a lot of radicals, and you might think that's because we're not feeding them, but in reality, our unification of Italy, although RP-wise is a great celebrated thing, mechanically it was a conquest, and so a lot of people are unhappy about it. Once they get a taste of our food, they'll change their attitudes, I'm sure. Anyway, as the army sailed to Santiago to take Chile, I also got the war against Argentina started. Argentina is famous for its asado and asadores, whose delicious beef is cooked over an open flame and served with fresh salads. A similar style of food is also made in Chile, where lamb is more common. Nonetheless, Chile has its own influence to add to the gastronomic union, including balbidiano, a jerky and onion soup. I can't possibly do justice to either of these nations' cuisines, and this pattern will continue as we add more nations to our culinary repertoire, which is to say that I don't know enough about food to properly appreciate the history of this stuff, so I'll simply apologize and say I'm not worthy and let your imaginations run wild. That aside, the fine grained journal entry completed as the master chefs of Piedmont finally crafted what they believed to be the best gluten-free pasta they could. This is the gluten-free rigatoni, a rice-based pasta from the rice paddies of Piedmont. The tubular nature of the food allows for the gluten-free nature of the pasta to hold a better structure, as one downfall of gluten-free variations of food is the lack of gluten makes them fall apart. Alongside that, once the other food companies get down to work, they'll be able to accent these simple rigatoni with sauces and other foods. With that great invention complete, we return to the invasion of Buenos Aires, where Piedmontese armies are sweeping the area, confiscating all of the asados they can find, and loading them up to return home for study. The secrets of the asado and balbidiano of Tierra del Fuego would give the gastronomists the knowledge they needed to create their magnum opus, the rigatoni al segreto. Segreto is Italian for secret, and this is where, again, my lack of actual food knowledge means I'm taking the cop-out. I can't describe to you how all this stuff would become a sauce, so instead, it's a secret sauce. A secret sauce which will be guarded by the Sardinian army to the death, if need be. The next nation to have their cuisine siphoned into Italy would be Switzerland, whose cheeses could make for an excellent topping to the already perfected rigatoni al segreto. I'd talk about the war, but it was pretty anticlimactic. No one came to defend Switzerland, and so they just kinda died. In case you're wondering about how well the groceries are performing building-wise, here in Piedmont we can see the main rigatoni al segreto factory where the righteously blessed Daily Pasta Company produces their secret rigatoni. It's making 30,000 pounds of profit on just 15 building levels, which is kind of crazy, at least if you ask me. In terms of the rice farms, the profits aren't so good, but what's more important about the rice farms is simply keeping the price of the gluten-free rigatoni down so the groceries can keep up their profits. If I do want the profits to go up, I'll need to start using some of the labor-saving production methods, as the standard of living in Piedmont is only getting higher and higher, leading to higher wages for each worker. Soon, the cost of the machines to help run the farm will be cheaper than the cost of wages. Having overseen the great unification of Italy and the growth of Italy's culinary culture, the philosopher king Carlo Alberto, the man that gave Italy everything, finally passed away in June of 1876, leaving his throne to his son, Vittorio Emanuele II, who historically was the actual king to unite Italy. Vittorio has inherited the role of a great king, and he intends to keep up that reputation, but he has a more liberal mindset compared to his father, as a member of the intelligentsia. Italian identity has been focused on those living within, well, Italy for a while now, but Vittorio intends to amend that to include anyone that engages in the rich Italian culinary world. He'll be enacting a cultural exclusion law which will expand Italian identity far beyond just its peninsular origins. The nation's strength is derived entirely from its people, and on account of that, the choice to limit Italian identity to just those relatively few people natively in the peninsula is a limit on the strength the nation could wield. In good time, Italy's going to become one of the best places to live on the planet, and anyone that wants to help create that place should be welcome. That is the opening statement at the Sardinia Piedmont Council of Pasta, where the technocrats running the nation were convinced by the newly crowned King Vittorio Emanuele II that cultural exclusion would be the way to go. Glad that he had convinced the council to embrace his way of thinking, the king next embarked on acquiring new materials for the ever-hungry rigatoni factories. He invaded the Congo, but not for the resource you might be thinking of. Rubber? What's that? No, the Congo has millet, which is also a gluten-free grain that could be used as a substitute for rice in a new line of pastas. Millet is a resource in Victoria 3 that is commonly found in Africa, and it falls under the same company as rice, corn, and rye, as mentioned before. We can't use rye because it has gluten, but millet definitely works. The invasion of the Congo was trivial, of course, but what wasn't so trivial was some of the backlash that the king and his council were receiving over the cultural exclusion laws. It seems that some Italian people are not so willing to let foreign customs infect what they believe to be their perfect culture, and fearing a nationwide revolt, the council called off the king's law. A setback for sure, but the king will not give up so easily. Seeing that the nation is rather unruly, especially after the death of the legendary Carlo Alberto, the council instead convened to create a police force to try and quell these rebellious spirits. That law would pass quite easily and was followed up with some regulatory bodies to reduce the dangerous conditions of pasta making. I hit about 13 standard of living some time ago, by the way, and this is important because 13 standard of living, or at least around that, give or take a point or two, whatever, plus healthcare, plus the agricultural power block principle, can lead to some very high birth rates and very low mortality rates. Currently, I have nearly a 2.5% population growth, and that's before immigration. That's huge because every Victoria 3 game eventually hits a point where the main economic limit is workers. Running out of workers feels impossible in the early game when there are hundreds of thousands of peasants to employ, but you'll be begging for just another 10,000 workers once you hit the late game. We are soon entering the late game. In terms of trade, we haven't quite hit the critical mass of production to make any ridiculous numbers, but here's a quick check-in anyway, so you can get an idea of how we're doing. We're only exporting a couple hundred units of groceries, and we're still importing quite a bit of stuff, all of which is fine, but remember how these numbers look, because later you're going to be blown away by how much trade we engage in. In September of 1882, I went to war to take over Peru-Bolivia, which is a nice target to get, but one thing that's concerning me is how my lack of tolerance is causing the bloc's cohesion to bleed, as each of these Hispanophone nations are too dissimilar to my culture. I really do need cultural exclusion. Luckily enough, we passed regulatory bodies, and now things have calmed down a bit with the Italian national liberals, so we can make another attempt at passing cultural exclusion. By the way, it might feel like we're going through a lot of years rather quickly here, but that's mostly because not much beyond more economy building was happening in them. Nonetheless, the biggest economic development of this chapter so far has been the build-up to our prestige fertilizer good. With prestige fertilizer, we can make even more rice and millet despite our limited arable land, which in turn creates cheaper grain and thus more profitable groceries. Although certainly not as strong as other industrial supply chains like iron, coal, steel, and tools, it's important that when you consider company picks, that you choose companies that share supply chains, which can be a very good way to add value to every company in the chain. Grain, groceries, and fertilizer is a powerful combo, and you could even, as Italy, add in the Anglo-Sicilian Sulfur Company for the only source of prestige sulfur in the game if you want even more synergy. Anyway, attempt 2 at passing cultural exclusion begins now. The war in Peru-Bolivia ended in July of 1883, and with that, the king's full attention went towards the culture bill. The national liberals are protesting, but it seems like the people could radicalize enough to spark a civil war, but Vittorio Emanuele has faith that the law will pass before tensions can heat up enough to explode into war. By December of 1883, the law is in its last phase, but the civil war is heating up, and in fact, it got so bad that King Vittorio Emanuele II would pay the ultimate price for his work to expand Italian identity. He was shot by a national liberal partisan while on a routine walk through Piedmont. Quite a fate to imagine for the famous king who in reality ruled until his natural death. It was Vittorio II's son, Umberto, who was assassinated, himself the father of Vittorio Emanuele III, who you might recognize as the king of Italy that you can restore to power in Hearts of Iron 4. Regardless, in this world we have an underage King Luca di Savoia taking the place of his recently murdered father. The regent, Tomasz Golob, a Slovenian, was chosen because he could be trusted not to be a national liberal plant, given he himself would benefit from the increase in acceptance of other cultures in Italy. He was also chosen because he's a reformer, which will increase the chance of passing the law. It was likely on account of the outrageous murder of the king that the council kicked themselves into gear and got the law passed as soon as possible. They passed cultural exclusion in May of 1884, solemnly naming the law Vittorio's Law, which would remove legal restrictions on the rights of non-Italians and ensure that documents from the government would be available in several common languages of the kingdom, such as Slovene, French, Occitan, German, and Spanish. Spanish, of course, being because of the recently acquired South American members of the kingdom. New languages may be added as new immigrants arrive, but it should be noted this tolerance extends only to the white folks of the nation. Those Congolese people we conquered a while ago, they will still be quite discriminated. Italian identity at this point in history cannot be stretched quite that far without breaking. The National Liberals are still threatening revolt, but by now fervor for their movement is dying out, and many are expressing regret or even disgust over the death of the king. Regicide never quite feels right, does it? With the additional scientific aid of the various cultures inhabiting Italy, the secret to a more effective fertilizer was found. Moral V's immoral chemicals invented what would colloquially be known as the Sigretto sauce, in reference to the famous rigatoni al sigretto that had swept the culinary world in recent time. In this case, the sauce goes on the plants, not into the rigatoni directly, but all the same, it is another trade secret which gives Italy its edge over the rest of the world's food. As of May of 1885, the GDP is really starting to spike, and this is because of all our excellent companies which are generating wages we can tax, profits we can tax, and dividends which will be paid into the investment pool. It's a pretty solid game so far, and we're hitting the point where the economy really pops off hard. I'm also starting to spread the Italian culture to my subjects. Switzerland adopted North Italian culture in June of 1885. Now we can get to why I haven't clicked the button to form Italy yet. When you form a nation, any puppet tier subjects you have which share any culture that that formable has get annexed for free, which means that once I get Switzerland's autonomy down to puppet status, I can annex them at the click of a button. I could form Italy at any time, but with how Victoria 3 works, nation formables aren't really even that impactful, so I'm quite happy to delay it as long as possible to annex as many puppets as possible. We have lots more puppets to get to before we click this. Quick check-in on the rice farms of Piedmont, those old buildings we made back at the very beginning of the game. We can see now they make over 400,000 pounds of profit and have over 100% throughput. I'm going to kill those profits to put on a new production method which I literally just unlocked. Again, the main purpose behind these farms is to make cheap grain rather than directly to make profits, so this new PM might reduce profits but it makes more grain. Given the Technocratic Council's involvement in the running of the nation's companies, they decided to formalize their role in the rigatoni al sigretto production chain by implementing corporatized unions. In case you don't know what this law actually entails, it essentially says that rather than workers making unions amongst themselves, or worse, being banned from making unions, the government makes a union and the workers can join it. It's one of the founding principles of Italian fascism, and fascism broadly, and it sounds really chill on its own, but the idea of a state-run union would be abused in those kinds of governments to essentially make slaves out of the people. Nonetheless, we aren't using it in that sense here. Instead, imagine a cold bureaucracy which examines your aptitudes based on standardized testing, and then that bureaucracy assigns you a job as they see fit. It's similarly freedom-killing, but I suppose more tolerably so, if only on account of its non-violent nature. And with those changes in motion, the recently crowned but still underage king Luca di Savoia featured in many advertisements spread across Europe's newspapers that Italy is taking in immigrants of all kinds. Why go to America when Italy is closer, prettier, and nicer to live in? Italy shall become the shining beacon of prosperity for the wretched and poor, which will replace what the United States has failed to become. Speaking of the king, Luca is frankly less strong-willed than his father or grandfather on account of both his age and personality. While certainly still king and unquestioned in that role, the influence of the Pasta Council has only grown, but King Luca is more or less in a permanent mourning with the assassination of his father, creating a balance of power that all sides are agreeable to. The corporatized unions entered law in January of 1888. Meanwhile, radicals had come to replace the National Liberals as the guiding opposition for the people. Without a strong man like Carlo Alberto or Vittorio Emanuele II, they see no reason to have a king. After all, how can Luca be a good king when he only has one name? One name makes him half the king, so the radicals like to say. What does it mean? Who knows, but it sure riles up the crowd. As of June of 1889, the GDP is rapidly approaching 100 million pounds. The standard of living is above 14, and the population growth rate is still at 2.4% annually. There's a slight drop there at the end of the graph because I released the Congo as a colonial nation, by the way. By that point, the stirring radical movement had died down, as quite frankly the prosperity of Italy is lethal to radicalism. The economy continued to build, reaching 100 million pounds of GDP in October of 1891, and you can see via the graph in March of the following year that the line is going up rapidly since we expanded construction recently. One thing you'll also notice though is that we don't own a pretty solid chunk of our GDP. That's because when we conquered Lombardy, Venice, and South Tyrol, we did not also conquer the Austrian ownership of the businesses there, and up to now this hasn't really been much of a plot point simply because it didn't matter. Well, now it kind of is, because I'm getting so much construction that I'm starting to be limited by my reinvestment pool. Here's another little play pattern you can learn to improve your Victoria 3 gameplay. If you find that you're spending too much on construction, check your investment pool. If it's below £150,000 or around that number and actively decreasing or increasing at a very slow rate, then you need more profitable buildings so that your private queue can take on more construction sectors to alleviate your government spending. If your investment pool has over £1 million in it and is continuing to grow, you can safely build more construction, with the caveat that you will need to pause your government construction here and there to avoid a bankruptcy. With interventionism, a minimum of 50% of your construction will be put towards the private sector while also doing government construction, but keep in mind that that means you'll still be using the other 50% at perhaps untenable costs to your budget. Thus, to best make use of your investment pool, you should be expanding construction to keep up with it, but in so doing, you may bankrupt yourself, so just pause construction once in a while to pay off your debt, then resume construction. Now, this is a very micro-intensive task, and one which I rarely use on account of that, but to be very clear, that is the way you inflate your GDP to insane numbers. You have to actually use the investment pool, and I'll bet that if you're a new Victoria 3 player, you rarely even check in on it. In fact, if you have a game that's gone beyond 1880 and you started the game as a great or major power, I'll bet you have like £50 million in there doing nothing right now. Check your save file, and if it's right, you have to become a channel member and get your name in a company in the future video. If I'm wrong, then you have permission to unsubscribe, I guess. With that, we get to the potential solutions for the issue, the most common of which is to just make more buildings, but alternatively you can violently reclaim the stuff that other people have built. We're going to nationalize all the Austrian buildings in my nation, among perhaps other punitive measures against the empire. This return to war against the great European powers might feel unfitting to a kingdom focused on migration, but Austria is the whelp of Europe by this point, having long been gutted by German, Russian, and Italian wars. What's another beating to an already dead horse? War has taken the kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, and in war she will thrive. Calling on the alliance which created Italy, the kingdom brought Germany down upon their once brother nation of Austria, offering up the split state of Silesia as payment. Alongside the nationalization of Austria's businesses, I'll also be liberating Hungary so as to permanently remove the Austrian Empire from any relevance it could have otherwise had. The war broke out in July, but it's pointless for Austria to even try, as they received no support from any other nation to perhaps give them a chance at winning, and the Hungarians even joined the Italian side seeking their independence. Vienna was occupied within a few months, and then the war ended in March of 1893. That peace deal was signed with far less ceremony than the inauguration of the first labor-saving production method to be implemented on the rice farms of Piedmont. King Luca himself attended the christening of the first steam-powered tractor in Piedmont in May of 1893, smashing a bottle of looted Austrian wine upon it. With these tractors, we can increase the productivity of the farms, which by now is becoming a priority, as standard of living has risen high enough to render wages more expensive than machines. In the aftermath of the war, Piedmontese trade has only grown, with the trade centers there sending out thousands of groceries to the world, and hundreds of goods coming on from overseas to provide for the things that the local economy does not provide. As the standard of living steadily rises, so too does demand for things like clothes, furniture, and exotic plantation goods like tobacco. These are things which I do not produce, but which are nonetheless in demand. Standard of living cannot rise off of just groceries and nothing more, so these imports are important for continuing the spiral up of living standards. As for the domestic economy, I founded a new company, but one which is not nicely aligned with our food supply chains. This is the Gannon Patent Minerals Company, which I took for its coal and iron capabilities. As I mentioned before, the food companies are fine and make for a fun run, but companies that cover critical resources like iron and coal are, alone, extremely valuable. This company will make a whole lot of money using iron and coal as resources for our steel production, and were I trying to maximize my GDP, I'd next make a steel company, a motor company, and a car company, and then maybe a tool company, as those companies, when combined, are truly fearsome. Nonetheless, the Pasta Council's choice to make a mineral company is more reflective of their maturing role as no longer merely the purveyors of Italy's pasta, but instead the very purveyors of the nation. In terms of the migration campaigns I've embarked on so far, they've actually been relatively unsuccessful. Looking at Piedmont, we've got 11 million people there as of February of 1894, which is amazing, but they're mostly just South Italians and other North Italians coalescing into one state. That still benefits me, but I'd prefer if pops from overseas were coming in, as every person that moves to Italy is both an extra person for me and one fewer a person for the competing great powers to have. I'm starting to feel like trade is going to be a much larger role in this kingdom, soon evolving into an empire, and sometimes I like to just go really wild with how hard I invest into one avenue in Victoria 3. Vic 3 rewards specialization to a great extent, and I've spent the whole game specializing in food and its supply chains. Now it's time to specialize in trade. I added a humble 395 additional trade centers to Piedmont, looking to become a global center of transactions and trade here in Europe. One thing you may be noticing at this point is that the budget is quite strongly negative, but that I'm doing nothing about it. This is a fair thing to point out, however my solution will soon make itself well known. If I did not have this magic bullet in my pocket, I would tell you that the way to avoid this kind of debt spiral is to do the aforementioned construction pausing technique. I have built so much construction because my investment pool is huge on account of my immensely profitable industries, and I want that money to be invested into the nation. I need construction for that, but it's expensive. If you find yourself caught in a situation where you've made too much construction but you do have the investment pool to use it, consider simply pausing the construction for a few months or years as necessary to avoid going bankrupt. Always remember, debt is only bad if it results in bankruptcy. Otherwise, debt is just a tool to get more power in Victoria 3. Anyway, we'll get back to that magic bullet. For now, it's time to continue the great food wars, which have begun with the war on France. The truth is, the people are getting tired of their rigatoni al segreto, and they now need new culinary influences. The French are famous for their food, of course, albeit not as famous as Italy. The French are far too prestigious to simply be subjugated to the bloc, but there are perhaps overlooked aspects of French cuisine that could make for great contributions. The Occitans and their pain au chocolat will make for an excellent dessert to add to the menu, and so war began with the intent to dismantle the French kingdom. Beyond just Occitania, France had also conquered Belgium, and liberating the Belgians could act as a way to gain access to some excellent waffles and pancakes. Oh, and of course, to the Corsica lovers, I present to you the liberation of Corsica, the ultimate nation. Check out the Corsica Slaver Empire for some fun Corsica content, and we even looked at Corsican cuisine in that video by coincidence. Losing these territories will likely completely destroy the French kingdom, which has come to rely on exploiting their various exterior states. Not much of a loss in the name of culinary invention, if you ask me. Fighting France would be tough, if not for the fact that the Germans are already at war with France, and that Russia joined the war with a simple obligation. The combined might of Germany, Italy, and Russia will once again show that the autocratic monarchies of Europe are the dominant powers. The war began, and all the numbers are green. It's looking like it'll be an easy but long war. When battles have dozens to potentially hundreds of battalions in them, each individual battle can take weeks to even months to complete, so we'll be here for a while, which sucks given the expense an army can accrue. To hasten things, I went for a naval invasion into Normandy, not necessarily expecting to win, but instead to simply split the army into one way or another. Thankfully for me, the Norman invasion actually went quite well, and we secured a beachhead there for access to Paris. Although not in war together, the Germans and Italians ended up combining fronts in April of 1898, shaking hands and generally being happy to see each other. Given there are no overlapping ambitions of these two great empires, everyone is happy to make friends and share in their mutual assault on France. The Republic finally signed peace with Italy in September of 1898, surrendering unconditionally and partitioning their kingdom into several pieces, all of which will be welcomed into the Union of Gastronomists in due time. With this war, my budget has more or less been stretched to the limit, and at this point it's time to pull out that magic bullet. I've turned Argentina, Chile, and Switzerland into my Italian puppets, and I could hold out longer to get Occitania, Belgium, and Peru, Bolivia into my cultural sphere as puppets to make clicking this button even sweeter, but I need to click it now lest I bankrupt. Because the aforementioned nations are my culture and my puppets, they are instantly annexed upon forming Italy, meaning my credit limit will increase to reflect my new source of GDP via South America and the Swiss. What's more, the states we annex this way are instantly incorporated, so we get taxes from them, and thanks to those taxes, the budget is once more healthy. I won't lie, the borders are pretty as well. In South America, we control a peninsula not too dissimilar in shape to Italy itself, and the addition of Switzerland's Alps to Italy almost acts like a reference to the Andes that also separates the South American peninsula from Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. One downside of doing this is that now there are fewer members of my power block, so we'll be gaining mandates more slowly, but it's a small price to pay for how nice it is to house extra taxes and pops. In terms of great power GDPs, I'm working on overtaking the others as of April of 1899, where I rank 4th place behind Germany, Britain, and America. It's been really nice to see Victoria 3's AI shape up in terms of making GDP since release. I remember when an AI clearing 100 million was quite an event, and now we regularly see well over 100 million pounds of GDP among several great powers. Man, Victoria 3 has been cooking this past while. Oh, and kind of out of nowhere, I hit number 1 great power in August of 1899. I wasn't really reaching for it, but I suppose Britain's loss of India earlier in the game and my inflated army and navy due to recent wars has given me just enough prestige to get to the top. I don't really feel like a number 1 GP right now, but we'll earn that spot eventually. For now, we have to reap the rewards of our wars. And the way I'm doing that is by getting monopoly treaties in Occitania and Belgium, which guarantee that the righteously blessed Daily Pasta Products company will always own the groceries of our new conquests, and make immense profits from selling the rigatoni al segreto in those markets, with a nice price markup from the monopoly. This is how you do economic imperialism, folks. With the turn of the century, my standard of living has hit 16.5, putting me in 3rd place behind Puerto Rico and Sweden, whose standard of living are also quite high. I don't quite know how Sweden pulled it off, but hats off to the Folkhemmet, I suppose. Of course, this drew my attention to the fact that Sweden was conquered somehow by Finland. I don't know how it happened, but there it is. I believe Sweden is isolated to Gotland or something. I suppose they're better off for it according to standard of living anyway. In May of 1901, the Pasta Council welcomed Occitania to the Gastronomic Union, inviting them to share their secrets with the great Italian chefs. Although the rigatoni al segreto has more or less been perfected, the pain au chocolat, or as some might say, chocolatine, or as we say in Canada because we have to be weird, croissant au chocolat, will make an excellent accompanying dish. Anyway, you might remember those trade centers I queued up ages ago. Well, they're complete now, and let's have a look at our grocery industries. Here are our profits as of January of 1904. The building isn't even fully employed, and it's got almost 150,000 pounds of profit. Not bad for just some food. In terms of who's actually buying those groceries, we can check to see the world market to find that the Americans are buying the majority of the rigatoni al segreto we produce. Perhaps Italian emigres that have regretted the trip to New York are looking for a taste of home. In terms of who exports groceries, we can see that it's actually just me. Only Italy exports any groceries to the whole world market, meaning that people can choose between either eating their local lame cuisine or engaging in the fine dining of Italy's best chefs and food scientists. With that, we resume the food wars, as there are yet more nations whose culinary secrets must be unlocked. In December of 1907, a war to liberate Catalonia, Aragon, and Andalusia would brew, as Spanish cuisine included such dishes as paella and Iberico ham, among other excellent additions to the menu. As with the France War, Spain is simply screwed, especially since I've called in Germany to help out. Madrid was surrounded as quickly as October of 1909, and the countryside was ransacked. Talented cooks and chefs were spared, the rest were slaughtered and robbed, and peace once again took Italy in February of 1910. With this final war against Spain, the great food wars have more or less come to an end, and we enter the epilogue of Italy's great rise to the forefront of not just culinary history, but all history. We're going to skip ahead to April of 1913, where we can see that the GDP has skyrocketed to nearly $500 million, and that power block extends across the Western Mediterranean with an outpost in Belgium. The world is enjoying Italian products, with regional brands presenting slight alterations intended to appease different palates. From Occitania comes a rigatoni pasta and a croissant on the side. The flavor is sweeter but subtle enough to avoid being a dessert. From Belgium comes the rigatoni pasta with waffles, which serve the purpose of sopping up the leftover secret sauce. Alternatively, the paella dish in Catalonia and Andalusia can provide either another means of absorbing wayward sauce or else a palate cleanse between bites. As for Aragon, I don't know anything about Aragonese cuisine, so I'm going to skip on describing that one. Important to note, of course, that with all these dishes comes a healthy heaping of Argentine asado to give some protein to this otherwise highly caloric diet. With that, let's address the huge GDP. To be quite frank, you're not going to get this much GDP just making groceries. Most of this surge is from the Fiat company, which is making the prestigious Touran automobile. The company was made in July of 1910, and I named it Sulfi's Super Speedsters after one of our illustrious channel members, of course. Sorry your company couldn't be featured as much in this video, but I made it quite late in the game, so only got a few years of play. Nonetheless, you do get the privilege, Sulfi, of having the most profitable company on account of how amazing cars are for making money. Cars, especially prestige cars, do wonders for standard of living too, alongside being insane for profits, both in terms of the cars themselves and the steel, tools, oil, and rubber that go into making them. I finally hit the wall of population around this time, as I wasn't really getting that many migrants, although certainly some, and I wanted more pops, so I went to war for parts of China. Thing is, I made the unfortunate mistake of making them protectorates, which means they'll completely destroy my bloc cohesion. Without cohesion, I can't Italianize my other bloc members, and also some members will outright leave, like Occitania. I'd comment with more detail on these Chinese wars, but I'll also say that they were more or less just me being done with the run and doing random stuff. Perhaps we could say we're integrating Chinese cuisine into the Council of Pasta, but to say so wouldn't align with the mechanics, as I can't grant my culture to the Chinese, and they're actively dragging the bloc down. I ended the run in January of 1916 and checked out the culture map mode a bit, finding little of interest beyond French Peru, Bolivia, and a handful of other oddities. Then I figured we should do a quick check-in on the companies. Here's Juan San Pedro's premium pasta with nearly 200,000 pounds in profits. I'd say I'm amazed, but remember, this is the company I granted trade rights to, so most of that money is from the trade centers, not from the rice or millet. The actual rice farm which started off this run is doing okay, but is having employment issues, which I'm going to assume is due to there being lots of other profitable buildings here which can pay much higher wages and outcompete the low productivity of these rice farms. Since we're looking at Piedmont, it's got 36 million people in it, which is insane when you realize that today's Italy has about 59 million people in it total. Back to companies, our next titan of industry is Righteously Blessed Daily Pasta Products, making almost 750,000 pounds of profits off of their legendary rigatoni al segreto. Over in Piedmont, we've got nearly 300,000 pounds of profit on this gigantic food industry, which is failing to employ, likely again due to competition for wages. You'll see what I mean once we get to Solfi's super speedster stats. The final piece of the grocery trifecta is Moral V's and Moral Fertilizers, making a healthy £350,000. In the case of this company, individual buildings aren't as impressive, but when combined, they make some nice profits. Especially the German branch of the company, which has some solid demand over there for the big explosive industry of the German Empire's army. I suppose tangentially, Gannon Patton's mineral company does contribute to the supply chain since its prosperity bonus gives throughput to the fertilizers. However, I actually forgot to give them the industry charter for iron, meaning their potential profits aren't as high as they could have been. Iron and coal combined in a company are amazing, but just coal, not so good. I don't mention the sulfur because I gave a sulfur monopoly to the fertilizer company, although at least in Belgium there are a handful of sulfur mines in the hands of Gannon Patton's company. With that, we come to the Fiat company. Solfi's Super Speedsters, run by the historical character Giovanni Agnelli, is making over £1 million of profit, and most of that is coming directly from the over 200 automotive industries in Piedmont. This is the building sapping all the workers from the rest of Piedmont as their profits enable them to outcompete everyone on wages. Cars are very powerful, and I'd say overpowered, but acquiring the rubber and oil to make them can be a bit of an ask sometimes, and they enter the game so late that it isn't a huge deal if they're broken. And so, this playthrough comes to an end. It was a very fun one, and the very last thing I want to show you is the fact that there's very little starvation in the world, which is nearly certainly thanks to our trading. The places which are starving, like Aragon, some random spots in Africa, and in China, are places which have no trade centers, or which are occupied, or otherwise have temporary issues which are creating starvation in the moment. Otherwise, the abundance of high-quality food on the world market makes for a world where the people are fed, and life is easier than it might otherwise be. How hard could life be when you've got some delicious rigatoni al segreto to eat in your sporty Touran car? Thanks to all the viewers and channel members for the support. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.